My name's Jason, I'm 35, and I live in Denver. I work as a software developer, which keeps me pretty busy, but I always made time for my wife, Laura. We've been together for almost 8 years, married for 5, and I honestly thought we had a solid relationship. At least, I did until a few months ago that I met Laura at a mutual friend's barbecue back in 2014. She was funny, confident, and had this way of making everyone around her feel like they mattered. We clicked almost instantly. She worked in marketing, and her job had her constantly on the move, networking events, client meetings, you name it. But despite her busy schedule, we always made time for each other. For the first few years, everything was great. We traveled, bought a house together, and even talked about starting a family. But about a year ago, things started to change. Laura became distant, less engaged. She started staying late at work more often and seemed glued to her phone whenever she was home. At first, I chalked it up to stress. Her job had always been demanding, and I figured she was just going through a rough patch, but then, the little things started to pile up. She'd get defensive if I asked simple questions about her day. She'd laugh at texts but wouldn't tell me who they were from. And the intimacy? Practically non-existent. Whenever I tried to talk to her about it, she'd brush me off, saying I was overthinking things or being paranoid that I wanted to believe her. I really did. But deep down, I knew something was off. The moment everything started to unravel happened on a Saturday afternoon. Laura had gone out supposedly to meet a client for lunch. I was cleaning up the house, just trying to keep myself busy, when I noticed her tablet sitting on the kitchen counter. Normally, I wouldn't even think about going through her stuff. I'd always trusted her. But that nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't let up. That I told myself I'd just check her calendar, maybe reassure myself that I was just being paranoid. But when I opened it, I noticed she was still logged into her email. I wish I could say I hesitated, but at that point, my curiosity, or maybe it was my intuition, got the better of me. The first thing I saw was a string of emails with someone named Rick. At first, I thought it might be a coworker or client. But as I read through them, my heart sank. Last night was amazing. I can't wait to see you again. I miss the way you hold me when we're alone. When are you going to tell him? We can't keep sneaking around forever. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through message after message, each one confirming the worst. But the final blow came when I saw a photo attached to one of the emails, a selfie of Laura and my uncle Rick, smiling together in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. That I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. My own uncle. The man who'd been like a second father to me growing up, someone I'd trusted implicitly. Betrayal doesn't even begin to cover it. That I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the screen, trying to process what I'd just seen. How could she do this to me? How could he? My mind was spinning with questions, but I knew there was only one thing left to do. I had to confront her. When Laura finally came home later that evening, I was sitting in the living room, the tablet on the coffee table in front of me. She walked in, acting like everything was normal, but the moment she saw my face, she froze. "Hey, everything okay?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Guilt, maybe. That I didn't waste any time. I slid the tablet toward her, the email thread still open. "You want to explain this?" Her face went pale. She stared at the screen, then back at me, and for a moment, I thought she might actually apologize, might come clean. But instead, she rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. "Jason, it's not what you think," she said, her tone dismissive. "Not what I think?" I snapped. "You're having an affair with my uncle, Laura. What else could it possibly be?" She sighed, like I was the one being unreasonable. "It just happened, okay? You've been so wrapped up in your work, and I felt lonely. Rick was there for me." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She wasn't even sorry. She was trying to justify it, as if it was somehow my fault. "So your solution was to sleep with my uncle?" I asked, my voice shaking with anger. "You couldn't have talked to me? tried to fix things. She shrugged. I didn't think you'd understand. That was it. That was the moment I realized there was no saving this. The woman I married was gone, replaced by someone I didn't even recognize. I want you out, I said quietly, but firmly. Pack your things and leave. We're done. She stared at me for a moment, like she couldn't believe I was actually ending it. But then she scoffed, grabbed her bag, and stormed out without another word. As the door slammed shut behind her, I sat back down on the couch, staring at the now blank screen of her tablet. I felt empty, hollow. But beneath the shock and pain, there was a flicker of something else: relief. Relief that the lies were over, even if the healing was just beginning. That night, after Laura left, the apartment felt colder than I'd ever known it. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was deafening. I sat there on the couch for what felt like hours, staring at the door like she might come back, like this whole thing was some twisted nightmare I'd eventually wake up from. But deep down, I knew there was no waking up from this, that I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, the images from those emails flashed in my mind. Laura laughing with Rick, their messages filled with secrets and intimacy that were supposed to be ours. The betrayal wasn't just from her, it was from him too. My uncle. The man who had been there at every family holiday, who had given me advice when I needed it, who I had trusted implicitly. By morning, the anger started to set in. It was like a fire burning in my chest, replacing the numbness with something raw and unforgiving. I kept replaying everything in my head: every late-night text, every excuse about work meetings, every time I defended her when my friends joked about how busy she always was. I called my best friend, Mike, later that day. He was one of the few people I trusted enough to open up to. When I told him what had happened, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Man. I don't even know what to say, he finally whispered. Your uncle? That's next level betrayal. Yeah, I muttered, staring at the ceiling. I don't even know how to process it. Come over tonight, he said firmly. You don't need to be alone right now. I hesitated at first, but I knew he was right. Sitting in that apartment, surrounded by memories of Laura, wasn't doing me any favors. So I packed an overnight bag and headed to Mike's place. When I got there, he had a couple of beers waiting and didn't push me to talk until I was ready. We sat in silence for a while, the TV playing some random show neither of us was watching. Finally, I broke the silence. I keep wondering if I missed signs. Like, was it obvious to everyone else and I just didn't see it? Mike shook his head. You trusted her, man. That's not a flaw. That's what marriage is supposed to be. She's the one who broke that trust, not you. His words helped, but they didn't erase the ache in my chest. I felt like I'd been living a lie, and now that the truth was out, I didn't even recognize my own life anymore. Over the next few days, the emotional roller coaster continued. 1 minute, I was furious, punching pillows, pacing the apartment, replaying every argument we'd ever had. The next minute, I was drowning in sadness, wondering how the woman I loved could do this to me. I avoided my family. I didn't know how to face them, especially knowing that Rick would be at every gathering, pretending like nothing had happened. The thought of sitting across from him at Thanksgiving made my stomach turn, but eventually, I knew I had to confront him. I couldn't move forward without looking him in the eye and making it clear that he destroyed more than just my marriage, he destroyed our family. So, I called him. When he picked up, there was a moment of silence before he spoke. Hey, Jason. Just hearing his voice made my blood boil. Don't hey me, I snapped. You know why I'm calling. He sighed, like he was the one who'd been inconvenienced. Look, I didn't mean for things to happen the way they did. It just happened. I laughed bitterly. Yeah, that seems to be the excuse of the year. It just happened. You betrayed your own family, Rick. You slept with my wife. Do you even get how messed up that is? There was another pause, then he said, I'm sorry, Jason. I didn't want to hurt you. But he did hurt me. And an apology wasn't going to change that. You didn't just hurt me, I said quietly. You destroyed our family. Don't expect things to ever go back to normal. And with that, I hung up. It wasn't a satisfying conversation, but it was necessary. I needed to hear his pathetic excuse, needed to say my piece, even if it didn't change anything. In the weeks that followed, I started focusing on rebuilding my life. I threw myself into work, started going to the gym again, and reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of the betrayal felt unbearable, but little by little, I started to feel like myself again. One evening, as I was sorting through some old photos, I realized something. Laura and Rick had taken so much from me, but they hadn't taken everything. They hadn't taken my ability to trust again, to love again, to build a new life. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful, and that was enough. The days turned into weeks, and slowly but surely, I began to carve out a new normal. The apartment that once felt suffocating started to feel like my space again, not just a reminder of the life I had with Laura. I got rid of the things that held too many memories: our wedding photos, the little trinkets we picked up from vacations, even the couch we used to curl up on together. It was like shedding an old skin, but the emotional baggage? That was harder to shake. Every morning, I'd wake up with this tightness in my chest, like a weight I couldn't quite put down. I kept replaying everything in my head: what I could have done differently, if there were signs I missed, if there was a version of this story where I wasn't the guy left in the wreckage. But no matter how many times I ran through it, the ending was always the same. One evening, Mike convinced me to join him and a few friends for drinks. I wasn't really in the mood to socialize, but he was persistent. You've been cooped up for weeks, man. You need to get out, clear your head, he said, dragging me out of the apartment. We ended up at this dive bar downtown, the kind of place with sticky floors and a jukebox that hadn't been updated since the 90s. But the atmosphere was laid back, and for the first time in a while, I felt relaxed. While we were sitting at the bar, laughing over some stupid story from college, I noticed a woman a few seats down. She had this easygoing smile and an energy that felt familiar, but not in a painful way. It wasn't like with Laura. It wasn't a spark or instant connection. It was something quieter, more grounded. Her name was Emily. She overheard one of our jokes and chimed in, and before I knew it, we were talking. Not flirting, not trying to impress each other, just talking. It felt good to have a conversation that wasn't loaded with history or expectations. I didn't tell her about Laura or Rick. I wasn't ready to go there yet. But for the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about them. I was just present. We exchanged numbers before I left, but I didn't rush into anything. I wasn't ready for a relationship, and I didn't want to use someone else as a distraction from my pain. But knowing that there were people out there, new connections to be made, it gave me hope. Back at home, I started focusing on things I'd let slip during my marriage. I picked up old hobbies: playing guitar, hiking, even trying out photography. Things that made me feel like me again, not just the version of myself that existed in the context of Jason and Laura. The biggest shift, though, came when I finally opened up to my family about what happened. I'd avoided family gatherings since the split, not wanting to deal with the inevitable questions or, worse, having to see Rick's face. But one Sunday afternoon, my mom called, asking if I'd come over for dinner. She didn't push, didn't guilt me, just left the invitation open. I decided it was time. Walking into my parents' house felt surreal. Every corner held a memory, and I half expected Rick to be there, his usual smug grin plastered on his face. But he wasn't. It was just my parents, my younger sister, and a few cousins. Dinner started off casual enough, but I could feel the tension simmering under the surface. Finally, after we'd cleared our plates, my mom gently asked, "Jason, are you okay? We've been worried about you." I took a deep breath and told them everything. The affair. The lies. The betrayal from both Laura and Rick. There was a heavy silence when I finished, and then my dad, who's usually the strong, silent type, shook his head and muttered, "That son of a gun." My mom reached over, squeezing my hand. "We're here for you, Jason. Always." It felt like a weight had lifted off my shoulders. For so long, I'd been carrying this burden alone, but sharing it with my family made me realize I wasn't as isolated as I thought. They were just as hurt and betrayed by Rick's actions as I was. Over the next few weeks, I started feeling lighter. I wasn't fully healed, far from it, but I could see a future where this pain didn't define me. Where I wasn't the guy whose wife cheated with his uncle. I was just Jason. And that was enough. That I started seeing Emily casually. Nothing serious, just a few dates here and there. We'd grab coffee, go for walks, talk about everything and nothing. She knew I was dealing with stuff, and she never pressured me to open up more than I was ready to. Her presence wasn't about filling a void, it was about rediscovering connection without the weight of the past. One night, as we sat by the lake, watching the city lights reflect off the water, Emily turned to me and said, "You seem lighter than when we first met." I thought about that for a moment, then nodded. "I guess I am. I'm not where I want to be yet, but I'm getting there." She smiled, her eyes soft. "That's all that matters." And she was right. Healing isn't a straight line. It's messy, unpredictable, and often happens when you least expect it. But the important thing is to keep moving forward, even when it feels like you're standing still. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something profound. Laura and Rick took a lot from me, but they didn't take everything. They didn't take my ability to trust again, to love again, to build a new life on my own terms. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Months passed, and life began to feel normal again. Not the old normal, the one where I was blind to the cracks in my marriage, but a new kind of normal. One where I wasn't defined by betrayal but by how I was rebuilding my life from the ground up. My apartment didn't feel like a tomb of memories anymore. I'd redecorated, repainted, and tossed out anything that reminded me of Laura. It wasn't just about erasing her presence, it was about reclaiming my space, making it my own. I even started cooking more, something I'd left to Laura when we were together. It felt good to find small joys in everyday things. Work was steady, too. I threw myself into new projects, taking on challenges that kept me focused and gave me a sense of accomplishment. But the biggest change wasn't in my apartment or my job, it was in me. I wasn't walking around with that heavy pit in my stomach anymore. I wasn't constantly wondering where it all went wrong. I had faced the worst, and I'd survived. Emily and I continued seeing each other, and while it wasn't some grand love story, it was honest and easy. She gave me space when I needed it and was there when I was ready to open up. We didn't talk much about Laura or Rick, and that was fine with me. Our time together wasn't about the past, it was about enjoying the present. But as much as I was moving forward, there was one loose end I hadn't tied up yet. My family, while they knew about the affair, we hadn't really talked about it beyond that initial conversation. I'd avoided family gatherings out of fear of seeing Rick, fear of how awkward everything would be, fear of what I might say if I ran into him. But I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. So when my mom called, inviting me to my cousin's engagement party, I hesitated. "Rick won't be there," she assured me, as if reading my mind. "We haven't spoken to him since we found out." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't realized how much of an impact his betrayal had on the entire family. It wasn't just my marriage that he'd shattered, it was the trust and bonds we all shared. So, I went. Walking into that party was nerve-wracking. I hadn't seen most of my family since everything went down, and I wasn't sure what kind of reception I'd get. But as soon as I stepped through the door, my cousin Sarah rushed over, wrapping me in a hug. "I'm so glad you came," she said, pulling back to look at me. "We've missed you." And just like that, the tension started to melt away. My family didn't treat me like I was broken or fragile. They treated me like Jason, the same guy I'd always been. The night was filled with laughter, stories, and genuine connection. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged again. But, of course, life isn't without its unexpected twists. About halfway through the evening, I stepped outside to get some air, and that's when I saw him, Rick, that he wasn't supposed to be there. I don't know if he showed up uninvited or if someone forgot to tell me he'd come, but there he was, standing across the yard, drink in hand, chatting with someone like nothing had happened. My heart started pounding in my chest. All the progress I'd made, all the healing, I felt it slipping through my fingers in that moment. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, but another part of me knew I couldn't. Not this time. That I walked up to him. When he saw me, his face paled. For a second, I thought he might bolt, but he stood his ground. "Jason," he said, trying to sound casual, but his voice wavered. That I didn't waste time. "What are you doing here, Rick?" He shifted uncomfortably, glancing around like he was looking for an escape route. "I just wanted to be here for the family. I didn't think it'd be a problem." "A problem?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "You think you can just show up and pretend like you didn't betray your own family?" I said, my voice low but firm. "You didn't just cheat with my wife, Rick. You broke everything." For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I made a mistake, Jason. I've apologized. What more do you want?" "What more do I want?" The question echoed in my head. Did I want him to grovel? To disappear forever? To undo the past? But standing there, looking at him, I realized something profound. I didn't want anything from him. "Not anymore. I don't want anything from you, Rick," I said quietly. "Because you don't matter to me anymore. You're just someone I used to know." With that, I turned around and walked back inside, leaving him standing there in the cold. And it felt good. Not because I'd finally confronted him, but because I realized his betrayal didn't hold power over me anymore. I had moved on. The rest of the night went by without a hitch. My family rallied around me, and I left the party feeling lighter than I had in months. That night, lying in bed, I reflected on everything that had happened over the past year. The pain, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it had all been part of a journey I never wanted but somehow needed. It forced me to confront my fears, to rebuild my life, and to discover a strength I didn't know I had. Laura and Rick were chapters in my story, but they weren't the whole book. And as far as I was concerned, the best chapters were still ahead. By the time summer rolled around, it felt like I was finally standing on solid ground again. The shadows of Laura and Rick were still there, sure, but they didn't dominate my life the way they used to. They were more like distant echoes, faint reminders of a time that no longer had a hold on me. Work was thriving. I'd recently been offered a leadership position on a new project, something that would have intimidated me a year ago, but now felt like the perfect challenge. It wasn't just about career growth, it was about proving to myself that I could rebuild and excel, even after everything that had happened. But life wasn't all about work. Emily and I were still seeing each other. What started as casual had slowly grown into something more meaningful. It wasn't rushed or forced, it was steady and real. We'd spend weekends hiking, trying out new restaurants, or just lounging around, talking about everything and nothing. One evening, after a long day at work, we were sitting on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker against the night sky. She turned to me, her expression soft but curious. "Do you ever think about where we're going?" she asked. That it wasn't a loaded question, but it caught me off guard. Not because I hadn't thought about it, I had, but because for the first time in a long time, the idea of a future with someone didn't scare me. I smiled, taking her hand in mine. "I don't have all the answers, but I know I'm not looking back anymore." She squeezed my hand, and that was enough. We didn't need grand declarations or promises. Just the simple acknowledgement that we were both moving forward together. But, of course, life has a way of throwing curveballs just when you think you've got it all figured out. One day, out of the blue, I got a call from my mom. "Jason," she said, her voice tense, "I need to tell you something." My heart sank. It wasn't often that my mom called me sounding like that. "It's Rick," she continued. "He's in the hospital. He had a heart attack." For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. The man who'd betrayed me, who'd torn apart our family, was now lying in a hospital bed, and I didn't know how to feel about it. Part of me wanted to shrug it off, to say it wasn't my problem. But another part of me, the part that had grown and healed, felt something more complicated. "Do you want to see him?" my mom asked gently. I didn't answer right away. I told her I'd think about it and hung up. That night, I couldn't shake the thought from my mind. What would I even say if I saw him? Did he deserve my forgiveness? Did I need to forgive him to fully move on? These were questions I hadn't prepared for. After a restless night, I made my decision. The next day, I found myself walking into the hospital. The sterile smell, the beeping of monitors, the quiet murmurs of nurses moving through the halls, it all felt surreal. When I reached Rick's room, I paused at the door, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. He looked older, weaker. The once confident, smug man I remembered was now pale and hooked up to machines. When he saw me, his eyes widened in surprise. "Jason," he croaked, his voice raspy. I stood there for a moment, taking him in. Then I pulled up a chair and sat down. "I'm not here to make peace," I started, my voice steady. "I'm not here to forgive you, either. But I needed to see you." He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with something I hadn't expected. "Regret. I messed up," he whispered. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness." I let his words hang in the air before replying. "You're right. You don't." There was a silence between us, heavy but necessary, but, I continued, "I'm not carrying this anger around anymore. I've moved on. You're just a chapter in my story now, Rick. And I'm done reading it." I stood up, ready to leave, but before I walked out the door, I turned back to him one last time. "I hope you find peace, Rick. But that's your journey, not mine." And with that, I left. Walking out of that hospital felt like shedding the last layer of bitterness I'd been holding on to. It wasn't forgiveness in the traditional sense, but it was closure. I didn't need him to apologize. I didn't need him to suffer. I just needed to let go. When I got home, Emily was waiting for me. I told her everything, and she just listened, holding me close as I finally let out the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "You did the right thing," she whispered. "Not for him, for you." And she was right. It wasn't about Rick or Laura anymore. It was about me, my healing, my growth, my future. That weekend, I took Emily to a spot I used to hike alone, back when I was trying to figure out how to move forward. As we stood at the top of the trail, overlooking the city, I realized just how far I'd come. "I never thought I'd get here," I admitted, glancing over at her. "But you did," she replied, smiling. "And you're stronger for it. Life isn't about avoiding pain. It's about facing it head on, learning from it, and coming out the other side stronger than before." I'd been through the worst, but I'd built something better in its place, a life defined not by betrayal, but by resilience and hope. As the sun set over the horizon, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Not because everything was perfect, but because I was finally at peace with the imperfections, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. As fall crept in, bringing with it cooler air and shorter days, I found myself in a place I never thought I'd be again: at peace. It wasn't the kind of peace where everything is perfect and wrapped in a neat little bow. No, it was the messy, complicated kind, the kind that comes from surviving the worst and realizing you're still standing. Emily and I had grown closer over the months. What started as casual turned into something deeper, though we both took our time. Neither of us was in a rush, and that made all the difference. We respected each other's pasts without letting them define our present. She never pushed me to talk about Laura or Rick unless I wanted to, and that space was exactly what I needed. One weekend, we decided to take a trip up to the mountains. Just the two of us, a cabin, and the kind of crisp, quiet air that makes you feel like you're miles away from all your problems. We spent our days hiking and our nights by the fire, talking about everything from our favorite childhood memories to our dreams for the future. It was during one of those quiet nights, staring into the flames, that Emily asked me a question I hadn't been ready to hear until then. "Do you think you've forgiven them?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. I stared into the fire, letting her words sink in. Forgiveness. It was a word I'd wrestled with a lot. For the longest time, I thought forgiveness meant letting them off the hook, like saying what they did was okay. But sitting there, with Emily by my side and the world finally feeling right again, I realized something. I don't know if I've forgiven them, I admitted. But I've let it go. I'm not carrying it with me anymore. And maybe that's enough. She smiled, leaning her head on my shoulder. That sounds like forgiveness to me. Maybe it was. The next big shift came unexpectedly, as most things in life do. One day, out of nowhere, Laura reached out. It was a simple email, no dramatic subject line, no cryptic message. Just a straightforward, "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen for a long time, debating whether to respond. What did she want? Was she looking for closure? An apology? Did she think we could somehow mend the past? In the end, curiosity won out. I replied with a simple, "When and where?" We met at a small coffee shop downtown, a neutral place where the memories couldn't reach me. When I walked in, I almost didn't recognize her. She looked different. Older, maybe. Or just weighed down by her own choices. "Jason," she greeted me, her voice tentative. "Laura," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. That we sat down, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Not just for what I did with Rick, but for everything. For how I treated you, for how I lied. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it." I studied her face, looking for any hint of manipulation, but all I saw was regret. And to my surprise, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel much of anything, really. Just a sense of finality. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "But I've moved on. I'm happy now. I hope you find that too." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I'm glad you're doing well, Jason. You deserve it." And that was it. We parted ways, and as I walked out of that coffee shop, I felt lighter than I ever had before. Not because of her apology, but because I realized I didn't need it. I had already found my peace long before she reached out. Life continued to move forward, and with it, so did I. Emily and I eventually moved in together, and for the first time in a long time, I felt excited about the future. Not because I'd forgotten the past, but because I'd learned from it. The scars were still there, but they were just part of my story now, not the whole thing. And as I stood on the balcony of our new place, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized something profound. Sometimes, the hardest chapters lead to the best endings. By the time winter rolled in, life had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and brand new. The cold air didn't sting the way it had the previous year, when every gust of wind felt like a reminder of everything I'd lost. Now, it felt refreshing, like breathing in a clean slate with every step. Emily and I had fully moved in together by then. It wasn't some grand event with moving trucks and fanfare. It was gradual, natural. One night, her toothbrush was in my bathroom. The next, her favorite blanket was draped over my couch. Before I knew it, we were sharing a space and a life, and it felt effortless. But even as things were falling into place, there were still moments when the past crept in. Random triggers: a song on the radio, a certain restaurant downtown would momentarily pull me back to those darker times. But instead of drowning in those memories, I found myself acknowledging them and letting them drift away. It wasn't about forgetting, it was about not letting them control me anymore. Around the holidays, my mom called to let me know there was going to be a big family gathering. The kind where extended family from all over came together, and yes, that included Rick. I hadn't seen him since our brief encounter at the hospital, and I knew it was only a matter of time before we were in the same room again. "You don't have to come if you're not ready," my mom had said gently, but I was ready. Walking into that gathering, I felt an unexpected calm. I wasn't walking in as the betrayed husband or the nephew who'd been wronged. I was just Jason, the guy who'd been through hell and came out stronger on the other side. The house buzzed with chatter, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. I moved through the rooms, catching up with cousins, aunts, and uncles who'd all been part of my life long before any of this mess had happened. And then, I saw him. Rick was standing near the fireplace, talking to one of my cousins. He looked older, more worn down than the last time I'd seen him. Our eyes met across the room, and for a moment, everything went silent. But instead of the anger I expected to feel, there was just indifference that I nodded at him, nothing more, nothing less, and then turned back to the conversation I was having. It wasn't about making a scene or proving a point. It was about reclaiming my place in that room, in my family, without letting his presence shake me. Later that evening, as I was grabbing another drink from the kitchen, Rick approached me. He looked hesitant, like he wasn't sure if I'd throw the drink in his face or walk away. "Jason," he started, his voice low. "I just wanted to say, I'm glad you're doing well." It was a simple statement, but it carried weight. There was no apology attached this time, no excuse or justification. Just an acknowledgement. "Thanks," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I am." And with that, I walked away. It wasn't dramatic or cathartic, it was just final. The chapter with Rick was officially closed, not because he said the right thing, but because I no longer needed anything from him. As Emily and I left the gathering later that night, she squeezed my hand. "You okay?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in a long time. "Yeah. I really am." The new year came, and with it, new opportunities. At work, I was offered a promotion, a chance to lead a project I'd dreamed about for years. It wasn't just a career milestone, it was a symbol of how far I'd come. I wasn't the same person who had once been blindsided by betrayal. I was someone who had rebuilt his life from the ground up. Emily and I celebrated with a quiet dinner at home, just the two of us. As we clinked our glasses, she looked at me with that steady, unwavering gaze I'd come to cherish. "To new beginnings," she toasted. "To growth," I added, and as we sat there, surrounded by the life we'd built together, I realized something profound. The past will always be part of my story, but it doesn't define me. What defines me is how I chose to rise from it, how I learned to trust again, to love again, and to embrace the future with open arms. Life isn't about avoiding pain. It's about facing it, learning from it, and growing stronger because of it. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. As spring rolled in, life felt almost unrecognizable from where I'd been a year ago. The shadows of betrayal, heartbreak, and anger were still there, but they were no longer the defining features of my life. They were like distant scars, reminders of what I'd been through, but not what I carried every day. Emily and I had settled into a rhythm that felt easy and natural. We weren't rushing anything, but there was an unspoken understanding that we were building something lasting. It wasn't about forgetting the past, it was about creating a future that felt right. One weekend, we decided to take a spontaneous road trip to the mountains. It wasn't planned, just a "let's get out of the city" kind of decision. We packed a couple of bags, grabbed some snacks, and hit the road with no particular destination in mind. There was something freeing about that. No itinerary, no expectations, just the open road and each other. As we drove, we talked about everything: our childhoods, dreams, the people we'd been, and the people we were becoming. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was fully present in the moment, not weighed down by what had happened before. At one point, we stopped at a scenic overlook. The view was breathtaking: miles of untouched wilderness stretching out under a sky painted with hues of orange and pink. As we stood there, Emily slipped her hand into mine and said, "Do you realize how far you've come?" Her words lingered in the cool mountain air. I thought back to where I'd been a year ago, sitting in my apartment, staring at Laura's emails, feeling like my world had just crumbled. I remembered the sleepless nights, the endless questions, the anger that burned so hot I thought it would consume me. And yet, here I was, standing beside someone who saw me not as the man who had been betrayed, but as the man who had overcome. I finally replied, squeezing her hand. "And it's kind of incredible." She smiled, leaning her head on my shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Jason." Her words hit me deeper than I expected. I'd been so focused on surviving, on moving forward, that I hadn't stopped to appreciate just how far I'd come. The betrayal, the heartbreak, they were part of my story, but they weren't the whole story. That night, as we sat by the fire in the small cabin we'd rented, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. Laura and Rick had taken a lot from me, but they hadn't taken everything. They hadn't taken my ability to trust, to love, to find happiness again. They hadn't taken my resilience or my hope. Out of nowhere, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my mom, just a simple update about a family gathering coming up. But reading it, I realized something profound. I wasn't dreading seeing my family anymore. The idea of being in the same room as Rick didn't fill me with the same anxiety it once had. I wasn't carrying that anger like a shield anymore. When we got back to Denver, life picked up right where it left off. Work was busy, but fulfilling. I'd been promoted to lead a project that I was passionate about, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. I wasn't just getting through the days, I was thriving. Emily and I spent more time exploring the city, trying new restaurants, and even planning trips for the future. But it wasn't just about the adventures, it was about the quiet moments too. The lazy Sunday mornings, the shared cups of coffee, the comfortable silence that comes from truly knowing and trusting someone. One evening, as we were sitting on our balcony, watching the sunset, I turned to Emily. "You know," I said, "I wouldn't change any of it." She raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Really?" I nodded. "Yeah. Because everything that happened, it led me here. It made me who I am today. And I like who I've become." She smiled, her eyes soft and full of understanding. "I like who you've become too. Life isn't about avoiding pain. It's about facing it, learning from it, and coming out stronger on the other side." I'd been through the worst, but I'd built something better in its place, a life defined not by betrayal, but by resilience, growth, and hope. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a warm, golden glow, I felt a deep sense of peace wash over me. Not because everything was perfect, but because I was finally at peace with the imperfections. The past would always be part of my story, but it didn't define me anymore. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just surviving, that I was living.